Hello, friends. So, this is a short guided meditation focusing on compassion. With a meditation on compassion, we can use this to reflect on the various suffering that exists in the world and then ways of thinking, ideas, or opinions that we may hold and how they might perpetuate suffering for various groups of people. Bell Hooks, the great black feminist, often would start her talks with listing out the various systems of oppression which society can operate under. White supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, heteronormative, patriarchy. And there would often be others that she would add to the list, but pointing out that we exist in societies where such ways of thinking, such ideas operate, and they are, in a sense, the water in which we swim. So then, a person affected by one such system or structure can themselves have taken on negative views about another group oppressed by a different set of structures, or they might have internalized these ways of thinking against themselves. So then, with meditation on compassion, one can use a particular instance of suffering one has experienced, some instance of prejudice or instance of injustice against ourselves, and then bring to mind the nature of the suffering that caused for us. And as with metta meditation, the encouragement is always to start with oneself. So having compassion for oneself, wishing oneself freedom from that suffering. And then as one gets more familiar with the nature of that suffering, then one can start to extend one's imagination and see if there are ways of thinking that we ourselves might hold, views that we might hold, that might affect other groups of people in a similar way. So I will ring the bell to start the meditation and see how far you can follow the sound of the bell as it fades into silence, and then allowing the mind to settle. Listening to the sound of the bell. The sound, if one gives attention to the listening, only exists in the present, allowing the mind to notice what is it like right now. Noticing the silence that is behind the sound. You may start to notice the little sounds that are there in the background, in the environment. But rather than letting the attention get caught up by them, see if it is possible to keep the attention on the silence that is behind and between those sounds. allowing the mind to settle on that sense of listening. Gently turning the attention inwards, listening inwards. Does the body make any sound as it breathes? Breathing in and breathing out. Listening to the mood, listening to the emotional state, turning that sense of listening inwards. Allowing the mind to settle, wishing oneself well, giving oneself a sense of safety. May I be safe, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be free from suffering. Starting out with that sense of loving kindness and compassion towards oneself. So breathing in, may I be free from suffering, and breathing out, relaxing. If the mind is settled, if there's that feeling of safety, of trust in the present moment, trusting in the awareness, then one can gently bring to mind some instance of past suffering, some instance of racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, or other form of prejudice directed against us. Keeping in mind that sense of compassion for oneself, using this reflection to examine the nature of suffering in order to find a way to end it. The Buddha said he only taught suffering and the end of suffering. But in order to reach the end of suffering, we need to understand the nature of suffering. Only then can we let go of the cause of suffering. So within the context of having compassion for oneself, bringing to mind a difficult memory, and just noticing what does it feel like. If the memory is too painful or too intense, then one can stop and again just direct that compassion towards oneself. In Buddhism, we often talk about having compassion for all sentient beings, but we can so easily forget that we too are part of all sentient beings. If one is able to be with that difficult memory and notice the emotions that arise based on that memory, then one can gradually start to expand the circle of beings one includes in one's compassion. Reflecting, are there ways of thinking that we hold? Are there opinions or ways of speaking that we participate in that leads to a similar sense of suffering for another group of people? If one does notice such a way of thinking, then it is not a matter of condemning oneself, but just noticing how such ways of thinking have made us feel, and then reflecting, do we still wish to hold on to these ways of thinking that might cause suffering in a similar way for others? So breathing in, directing compassion towards oneself. May I be safe, may I be well, may I be free from suffering. And then breathing out, directing it to others. May others be well, may others be safe, may others be free from suffering. One can start out with a particular individual or a small group of individuals, for whom it is easy to have compassion, people we might be close to, people we may care deeply about, then the natural wish arises, may they be free from suffering. Breathing in, directing the compassion towards oneself, and then breathing out, directing it to others. And slowly one can start to expand the circle of beings one includes in one's compassion, in one's wish for them to be free from suffering, either bringing particular individuals to mind, or groups of individuals, people for whom it is easy to have compassion. May I be safe, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be free from all suffering. And then directing it to others, breathing in, having compassion for oneself, then breathing out, directing it to others. Slowly one can start to include people we might not know very well, acquaintances, or people we might see every day. We might know their faces, but maybe we don't know much about them or don't know them very well. But we do not have any particular negative feelings towards them. Again, either bringing to mind particular individuals or, or groups of individuals, expanding the circle of beings one includes in one's compassion, in one's intention for them to be free from suffering. If you have a longer period of time available for this meditation, you can spend longer on each of these groups, wishing them freedom from suffering. If the mind is fairly settled and there's a sense of compassion, that has arisen, then one can see if it is possible to extend that compassion, that wish for beings to be free from suffering, to beings or people whom we may have negative feelings about, either because they may have done actions that may have harmed us, actions that harm others, opinions we find distasteful. What is it that arises if we attempt to extend that sense of compassion to include these beings as well? It does not mean one approves of their negative action, but to see, is it possible to consider, to extend the intention? May these beings also be free from suffering. And in case it gets too intense or too difficult, then one can stop and then again starting with oneself. May I be safe, may I be well, may I be happy, may I have ease of living, may I be free from all suffering. And then breathing out, directing that compassion to others, gradually expanding the circle of beings we include. And seeing, is it possible to extend that sense of compassion until it includes all sentient beings, no matter what they might have done, no matter how they might think in harmful ways? If the thought arises, I cannot have compassion for this particular being, and that is completely fine. It is just a matter of investigating the nature of the mind as one brings this thought, this intention to consciousness, gradually examining what arises as one forms the intention to direct compassion to include all sentient beings. So I will ring the bell to end the meditation, and again see how far you can follow the sound of the bell, and then as it fades into silence, just noticing the silence. Thank you, friends. I hope that was of some benefit. Thank you for all your effort.